font is too small. So moving forward from today, I will ensure that the font is a little bit is bigger for everybody to read. I will read the slides for today, just so that we can kind of get a better understanding of what we're doing, what we're talking about. Before we begin, we'd like to start our class with prayer. Is there anybody who has any prayer requests or anything like that? William Thompson. All right. Well, let's bow our heads, go to our God. Almighty God, we come before you this morning, and we thank you so much for your love. We praise and give you glory and honor forever and ever. We just hope and pray that this class is acceptable in your eyes and in your will and wisdom. We lift up prayer requests for the Williams-Thompson family and their loss. We know that your love will surround them and give them and bring them peace. We know it's a difficult time, but we know that eventually your peace and grace will envelop them. We give you praise and glory for your word and the information we're about to learn. We know that all things are created from you and through you, and that it's only us as human beings who try to interpret the things that with our feeble minds, interpret the things you've put in our lives. We ask that you be mindful that you watch over those who are needing our prayers that weren't mentioned today. There's a number of us that are in this congregation that are sick or dealing with health issues. We know there are people dealing with financial and personal issues, and we lift them up to you because we know you know all things, and all things are from and through you. We thank you for your word again. We thank you for the example you've given to us through your son's life and all of those who have gone before us. We ask that you help us to be mindful, keep our minds open and our hearts ready to serve. We love you, and we pray this in Christ's holy name. Amen. So, good morning, everybody. My apologies again for being a little bit late this morning. I've been asked to kind of review the four different types of hypotheses, or the four categories of the hypotheses. And let's see, I might be able to go back a little bit just so we can talk about that, because I know there was a few of us who were not here to discuss this. I think this is a good spot. Okay, so this slide really kind of explains. So there are a number of ways. Again, this is a look at what scholars, how they address the writings of the Old Testament. And we need to remember that scholars, at least in the modern sense, cannot rely on faith-based actions. What I mean by that is the miracles that we read, and we're talking specifically about the Old Testament. So the miracles such as Moses striking the rock and water coming out, or manna falling from the sky, or the fire that leads the Israelites through the desert. Scholars have to have what they would consider a physical or scientific basis for that action. They cannot just say, well, it happened, it's written, so therefore it happened, so it's true. That's not how scholarship works. It's just like a number of things when we teach our kids. We got to remember that even though we're not children, we are children when it comes to this stuff, because this is new stuff to us. We are learning it. So we are, in a way, children of this type of scholarship. Okay? Now, that being said, we do, as faithful believers, have faith. And this class does not have anything to do with diminishing the faith. It's just a view as to, okay, what can be shown or described, or what does the physical evidence, so when anthropologists and archaeologists go and they dig a site, what is the physical remains that they find? Okay? So we've talked about this in the past. The writings. What kind of writings are archaeologists or anthropologists or historians finding in these sites? Not a lot. Very little of that writing remains. What does remain is writing that is maybe found on pottery or on walls that are excavated. Everybody's seen like the temples in Egypt, and you see the hieroglyphics. Okay, that's a physical evidence. That's physical evidence that a scientist can say, or a historian, anthropologist, archaeologist can say, we can date, we can demonstrate, and we can show that this actually happened. What we can't show, we can't show. Now, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen or that it can't be shown at some future date. But what this means today is that as of today, we cannot demonstrate with any physical evidence or chemical, doing chemical tests or scientific tests or DNA analysis, any of that stuff. None of that stuff has demonstrated anything that we cannot demonstrate. I mean, that's kind of a circular argument, but we cannot show what we cannot show. That's really what it boils down to. What we have been talking about the past month is the Torah, the Pentateuch. Okay, the Torah is Hebrew, Pentateuch is Greek, and we've talked about how there's Greek translation and then there's the Masoretic or the Hebrew translations. The translations themselves don't have a lot to do with what we're talking about foundationally this past month. The primary hypothesis, so the primary theory that a majority of the scientists, historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, can show or have studied, because you guys, those of you who work, and we've all worked, but you work 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day. Those of you who were homemakers, 24 hours a day, raising kids and stuff. That was your life. You knew the ins and outs of your stuff. That's the same thing with these people who are writing these hypotheses, these theories. This is what they do for a living. This isn't a casual flyby, hey, we spend an hour here, an hour there. We're spending our entire lives studying this. And some people study just fragments, just little portions of rock for years to try to get this information. What we have been studying the past month is the primary theory that scholars have come up with about who wrote the Torah and how it was written. We're just talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. We have discussed over and over again that, yes, there is an oral tradition. And for those of you who do not know, this is, again, my ADD kicking off, but I wanted to bring this up earlier before we started class. Passover is this week. Passover starts Wednesday night. The first Christians who were not on the West never celebrated Easter on a Sunday unless the 15th of Nisan, which is the day of the Passover, was on a Sunday. They always celebrated it on the same day that the Jews celebrated the Passover. It wasn't until after the 1st century CE that things started getting divided. Many of the churches in the East, so Antioch, Damascus, the churches in Syria, the churches in Iraq, they continued to celebrate the Passover, not on Sunday, but on the day of the Passover. So they celebrated Easter on that same day. That didn't really fall out of favor until about the 6th or 7th century BC, or Common Era. I just wanted to bring that up because, again, it demonstrates that there was not one consensus from the very beginning. There has always been dispute. And the reason I bring that up is because I was reading something about the Passover, not necessarily Easter, but the Passover and how Jews celebrate the Passover. Because I'm not very familiar with rabbinic Judaism. So Judaism after the fall of the temple, so 70. So you don't have the priesthood anymore. You don't have the sacrifices. The Jewish faithful, the Jewish people, for the majority of them, have multiple interpretations of the Torah. They don't just read the scrolls. They don't read the scriptures. They have a whole catalog of books called the Mishnah and a couple other books. But one of the primary things that they rely on is the oral Torah, which honestly I've heard of before in the past, but I never really understood what that is. And what it is, at least a general summary of it, is a summation of the Torah. Because Jews, very much like us, traditionally believe that the Torah was written by Moses. That is what's preached in the synagogues. But they also recognize that Moses probably didn't write everything. So a lot of the Torah that he wrote was actually oral traditions that got passed down, which is why the Hebrews, the Israelites, Jews, have an entire school dedicated to memorization of just the Torah. Because they memorize it, they have scholars or they have students who memorize the Torah, so that way, in case the Torah physically is lost, it can be rewritten. Yes? I'm identifying the Passover with the Last Supper. That's the English version, yes. Correct. Correct. But the Roman Church, the church in Rome, not the Roman Church. When I say the Roman Church, most people think Catholics. I'm not talking about the Catholics, because pre-Orthodox or roughly, and this is again another generality, pre-Constantine, so pre-320-ish Common Era, there was a church in Rome. But there was also a church in Antioch. I'm sorry? 2nd century, 3rd century Christians, right. There's some really great documentation of some church fathers who go to Rome and debate with the bishop of Rome. He's not the pope. Doesn't become the pope until about the 5th century. That's when the title becomes that way. But the bishop of Rome, where the Eastern churches start to debate the Western churches. And initially, they don't agree. They never agree. But initially, the Bishop of Rome concedes that, hey, the church is in the east, you do your thing, we're going to do our thing. So you're going to celebrate Passover, you're going to celebrate Easter on the day of resurrection. We're going to celebrate Easter on the day of his death or sacrifice or the Last Supper. Okay. And again, I'm not as familiar with that kind of argument. I will say that Easter is an English word, or a derivative of Germanic, English, French words. In the East, it's called the Pesach, which is the sacrifice. That's what the Pesach means. So you have the that's where you get the Paschal lambs, the Paschal words, and so forth. Yes, ma'am? So, correct. They worked on a lunar calendar, and they still do. So the traditional Jewish calendar is on a lunar calendar. So 28 days. The problem with that is that because it's not a complete 365 and 2.67 day calendar, it goes off after a while. So that is why, so I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe it is the first full moon after the spring equinox. It has to, so in modern terms, Easter is the Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, which is why it extends from the middle of March or the end of March all the way to the end of April. It varies. And that's the same thing with the Passover, every other holiday. I was reading this a couple years ago. In 50 years, most of us know that Hanukkah, it coincides generally with Christmas. In either 50 or maybe 100 years from now, Hanukkah is going to be in the summer because the calendar rotates, because it's not complete. So that's generally the way science works, okay? And this is part of this whole, when we have these discussions and we realize, you're right, that's different. Or my view of that thing, I didn't know that, because we don't have a regular interaction with Jews that are not in the diaspora. In other words, we're not in Israel, so we don't interact with them on a regular basis. For example, and I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, the word Allah is God. It's God in Arabic, it's God in Aramaic, and the derivative, Elah, is Hebrew for the God, which is where we get Allah. They're all derivatives. So when you hear somebody say Allah, praise Allah, okay, you're right. Praise my God, because he is the God of everything. He's not just my God. He's not your God. God isn't mine to hold in a little cage. He's not a little birdie. God is God. If you want to call him Allah, okay. It's just like saying Jesus or Jesus. It's the same word. So, sorry about getting into the Passover and the Paschals, but there's a lot of interesting stuff out there. And maybe one day we'll do a class talking about the first century Christians and how things developed before Constantine. And it wasn't really Constantine. It was more than that. But before there was a consolidation of what we consider now Christianity. Getting back to our class, or the function of our class. So, to answer your question, the most common theory that scholars put forth when they started this process was the four-source hypothesis. So they identified four major, it's not four individual writers, four categories of writing in the Torah, okay? It is the J source. J is in German, they don't use Y, the letter Y. So in German, it's J. It's for the, it stands for Yahweh, okay? Except in German, it's Yahweh, okay? So that's why there's a J. You have the E source, which is the Elohim source. So the writer focuses not on, and I know it does sound like semantics, but you have Adonai, you have Yahweh, and then you have Elohim, the Lord. They both mean the same person, the same entity, the same thing, God, but they're different titles. And they're used differently in the Hebrew worship, okay? No one, and that's why I try to restrict my words to Adonai. No one uses the divine name in Hebrew. It is so sacred. That's why we actually don't know how to pronounce it. We really don't, because the Jewish writing has no vowels. So Y, H, W, Y. That's the divine name. And as we'll talk about, after the destruction of the temple, and we really won't talk about it too much, but after the destruction of the temple, 70 AD, the traditional biblical language went out of use. Hebrew writers from the 2nd century on until 1947, after the installation of the new Jewish country, Israel, didn't use Hebrew. They used the local language. Hebrew was not brought back into fashion until the new Jewish state. Now, there were certain scholars and so forth who learned who did use it. It was used in some form in their services, in their synagogue services. But it wasn't a studied language. It was a dead language, much more dead than Latin. But for 2,000 years, no one spoke the divine name. So people forgot how to actually pronounce it. So instead of an A between the Y and the H, it could be an E. It could be Yahweh. It could be Yahweh. It could be Yahweh. The most common way we translate that is Yahweh, Jehovah. That's where Jehovah comes from. So the J that you see in the J source, Jehovah is the German word Jehovah, which is the German translation of the divine name. So that's the J source. The E source, the same thing, is written by somebody who, or a group of people that identified and utilized the word the Lord as opposed to Adonai, which also means the Lord, but it is a specific. Elohim, just like Allah, Al, A-L, E-L, are the same entity. Elohim, or Allah, means God who challenges. That's where the original name, El is the God. Al is the God. So Elohim is the God. Ohim is a breakdown of the word. It literally does mean, and I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, does mean the gods with an S. But for centuries, we have been translating it as God. But really, it's just like the word buy. I'm going to go buy something. Buys. It's language. It's there's an S there, but if he goes to buy and he buys something, still means they're going to go buy. Maybe one thing, maybe multiple things. Elohim means gods, but in every religious context, it just means God. The D source is the Deuteronomy, and I never can pronounce this word right, Deuteronomistic, the Deuteronomy writer. Primarily, the D source is focused on Deuteronomy. Why is that? Because most scholars believe that Deuteronomy was the first book of the Torah that was compiled. So, who did it? We don't know them. We don't have names. What we do have is, okay, they wrote the majority of this section. And then the P source is the priestly source. So that is either written by priests, it's actually a combination, most scholars believe. It was written by priests or written for priests. Written by priests, for priests. So it's specific as to what sacrifices does the priestly class, not just priests, includes Levites, because the Levites are like junior priests, a deacon for all intents and purposes. So these are the rules written for them specifically. So what do we do at the temple? What did we do at the tent of meeting? You know, those kind of things. So that's the information. Does that clarify things for you? Okay. I know it is confusing, especially if you don't look into this a lot and this is your first time experiencing it. But the primary thing is that there are 4 categories of writing that can be identified. It's not necessary for individual writers. It's 4 categories of writing that got combined together. Whether it was from the oral tradition and then they just put their own little spin on it, or they made it up themselves, that's not a debate we're going to have in this class because I don't know the answer to that. But the thing is there are 4 primary categories of writing. So it's like, we call the Bible a book, right? But it's not a book. It's books. It's a collection that get combined together, and it's the Bible. And until about 400 years ago, the only thing that was divided in these things was the title of the writer, of the writing. There were no chapters, there were no verses, and if you go to the 1st century, there was no punctuation. So you didn't know when your sentence ended or when it started, which is why sometimes when I read the Bible, especially that I'm older, it frustrates me because I'll see a chapter break in the middle of a paragraph. And I'm like, who decided to break here? Why don't we go down 2 more sentences where there is a paragraph break and break there? So part of my brain, and this is just fluff, I've really kind of learned to ignore the chapters, not so much the verses, but the chapters. And the verses do the same thing sometimes as well. There'll be a verse split in the middle of a sentence And you're like, okay, well, I get that. Maybe that makes it easier but the really interesting thing in theory, it's a theory that I kind of come across, is the chapters and verses are really for scholars, not for us. Other than just to say, okay, this is where we're going to start reading, not where we're going to end up. Correct. It's the Dewey Decimal System of the Bible. Did you have a question? That's okay. I don't remember things either. Yeah. All right. So, I hope, and again, if I need to repeat this portion of the class or any other portion of any class, don't hesitate to ask, okay? It's important, it's not important that you understand it. It's important that you at least grasp it, because it is complicated. And especially if you've never studied this stuff before, never looked at it, never heard of it before, it can be challenging. So this is another example, and I hope it just only skipped one. So I put in here, and maybe you weren't here for this class, but I just put 3 different scholars who have different ideas of when these books were compiled. So Dr. Baden thinks that J was produced in the 10th and 9th centuries, and then E in the middle of the 9th century, the D source in the 7th century, and then the P source in the 6th century. So, okay. Right. 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 But these sources are people who compiled it. They put it together from their stories, from the writing, either previous writings, which we can't find, or previous oral traditions, like we talked about at the beginning of class, where they had people who did study. That's the scribe. The scribe didn't just write. The scribe was the scholar. He was the student. So he memorizes these things. There was a great movie. There was a really good movie with what's his name? It's a post-dystopian modern movie that came out a couple years ago. A blind guy, and I remember his name down the road. He played the pilot in not Flight 93, the one where the plane flies upside down. Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington plays a blind guy who it's like the end of the world has happened, or whatever, the world's collapsed, and he is carrying a book, and it's the Bible. And there's some bad guys who, because books are very expensive and they're very important, and he's chased by these bad guys, and at the very end they capture him, and they end up taking the book from him. And then when they open the book, because they're like, yeah, we got the book, it's all in Braille, and nobody could read it, and they destroyed that Bible, which was apparently like the last copy of the Bible that anybody could find. The thing is he memorized the entire Bible, so when he's rescued, he gets taken to the destination where he was trying to take the book to, and they're like, thank you for trying your best, but just letting you know the Bible got destroyed. And then he turns, because he's blind, he just turns to the voice and he says, in the beginning, God created the heaven. And he starts dictating the entire Bible because he had memorized it, reading it. That's literally, now, that's amazing. I mean, we're just talking about maybe memorizing the book of Deuteronomy or maybe the book of Exodus. But he's going Genesis through Revelation in that movie, which is crazy. But nonetheless, so this is one example of one theorist, of one scholar who's got it broken down this way. Let's go. There you go. Now we got a different doctor. Yes, because it's not Shane. but we won't tell them that. So now we got a different scholar who says J and E existed before the exile, and the P source is written in the 6th century BCE, 720 to 680. Deuteronomy is then written later, and then finally all these books are put together after the exile, so after the return. So now we're like, okay, here's a completely different theory, a different timeline of when these books were put together. And then I have there's a third slide. It'll come up eventually. Dr. Carr says Deuteronomy is written first. One sec. Deuteronomy is written first, then the P source, then J and E are put together during the exile and after the exile, and then it's not even completely put together until around 300 BCE, which is another 200 years, 300 years before the first slide we saw where the doctor was saying, oh, it's 10th century, 9th century, 8th century, 7th century. This is 5th, 6th century, 5th century, between the 5th and 3rd century BCE. So there's all sorts of theories, nothing is 100%. Question? Book of Eli. Thank you. It's a great movie. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good movie. So, as I've pointed out, there's no consensus as to when this happened, except for the majority consensus, and again, this is debatable, that Moses didn't write it. Okay? Doesn't mean he didn't tell the story. Doesn't mean that he didn't write it and then it got lost. We don't have the physical evidence for that. Okay? That's really what it boils down to. We don't have any physical evidence. It's not written in the Old Testament. There's nothing that says, I, Moses, wrote all these words down. And as we talked about last week, it's kind of hard to conceive that if we are going to say that Moses wrote the entire Torah, word being entire, how does he write about his own death and burial? And then you can say, well, then somebody added it to the end. Now you're talking about, okay, so then he didn't write the entire Torah. He wrote 99% of it. And that's how the dominoes fall. You get one spot, well, it doesn't make sense that he could have written it if he's already dead and he's writing about his death. Then you get things start to come apart, which is why the scholars are like, okay, so let's look at it from this perspective. What can we prove? What can we show? I don't disagree with that at all. Mm-hmm. But they don't. No. They may be in possession of some of them. The church the church in Rome has a good portion of them. The church in Antioch and the church in Syria and Damascus have a good portion of them. A large portion of manuscripts currently are being held by the British Library. The British, in World War I, between World War I and World War II, decided they were just going to take whatever they wanted and take it back to England. So the English have a large portion of it. And if you watch any of the Indiana Jones movies, the Germans also have a bunch of... All right, can we advance this slide? Let's one more. One more. There we go. This is where we ended up last week, which is fun. So to summarize what I just fast-forwarded through to remind everybody. So we talked about what is the characteristics of the J source. So the J source is very anthropomorphic. So it gives Adonai, gives Yahweh, physical characteristics. So he walks through the garden. He meets with these people. He meets with Moses. He speaks to things. He speaks things into creation. That is the J source, typical J source, okay? Those are issues that we find in Genesis. Well, so we talked about some of the things that you can identify as the J source material in Genesis. Now we're in Exodus. So we're in the second book of the Bible. One of the things I always found curious, and maybe it's just me, is you get the story of the Exodus up until about the 24th chapter. So we know Exodus 20 is the 10 Commandments. There is another 10 Commandments in Leviticus, a rehashing of the 10 Commandments as well. So there's two 10 Commandment lists. But then you get a break, and then you start talking about the laws. That clear break is an indication that you have two separate stories. Now, does that mean, let us presuppose Moses is right, and we'll end here, and we'll start with Exodus. Let us presuppose Moses did write the Torah. Okay? So if we presuppose that, then we have Moses writing about the Exodus, and then he writes about the laws, starts writing about the laws and the rules that we have to follow. If he wrote the 5 books, did he write them in books? Or was it just one long story? Or was it 20 books? Or was it 6 books? Because again, like our chapters and verses, they didn't call them books. They didn't have breaks in that sense. So the presupposition that Moses writes these is fine, but were they divided the way we divide them now? And I'm going to leave that question for you to think about and ponder, pray about, and there's no answer. There's not going to be an answer, and the answer that you find for yourself is the answer that is best for you. Because my interpretation of my salvation is for me, in my means. Now, there are certain rules, there are certain obligations that we must have, we must follow. But nowhere in the Old Testament or in the New Testament does it say you have to believe Moses wrote the entire Torah in order to be saved. Because that's not a salvific action. That is a personal interpretation that just became part of the modern consensus. Questions? Sure, sure. I'm sure there's an answer. There's a scholarly answer to that. I don't know what that is off the top of my head. Those names did come about, but they don't show up in the record until after the exile. That I'm certain of. That I do know. The titles of these books. Does it mean that, again, like you said, is it one giant book? Because it's a scroll. If you've ever been to a Jewish synagogue, and you look at the massive scroll that they have hanging right where our baptism is. It is a huge document, and it is the entire Torah. It's not the entire Old Testament. It is simply the Torah, the first 5 books. But it's one scroll. And they don't have chapters and verses written in them either. Any other questions? I really appreciate your time. Have a great rest of your Sunday.